The bullet hole in the old truck's windshield left a perfect spiderweb pattern, like a roadmap to hell spreading across the glass. Funny how life works that way. 30 years of quiet exile shattered in an instant by a single black backpack abandoned in a snow-dusted cornfield. They say the most dangerous secrets aren't buried in government vaults or corporate servers, but in the hearts of old men who've learned to live with their ghosts. This morning, Bobby McAllister was just a small-town mechanic with grease-stained hands and fading memories. By nightfall, he'd become the most hunted man in 3 states, with blood on his jacket and classified hard drives hidden beneath his truck seat. Sometimes redemption doesn't arrive with trumpets and ceremony. Sometimes it shows up unannounced, dragging behind it the shadows of your past mistakes, offering one final chance to make things right, even if it costs everything you have left. In the dying light of an Oregon sunset, an aging whistleblower and a wounded scientist run for their lives, while somewhere in Seattle, the countdown to a global nightmare has already begun. The autumn wind carried a chill through the Clearwater Springs Valley, rustling the remaining cornstalks in Bobby McAllister's field as if they were whispering ancient secrets. At 68, Robert Bobby McAllister felt that chill deeper in his bones with each passing year. The weathered hands that once designed critical components for the Apollo missions now tightened a stubborn bolt on Darrell Wilkins' Ford tractor, a 1978 model that most mechanics would have condemned to the scrapyard years ago. "Come on, you stubborn son of a gun," Bobby muttered, applying just the right amount of torque, not enough to strip the threads, but sufficient to secure the manifold. His workshop, reliable repairs and restorations, was a cathedral of mechanical resurrection, where dying machines came for a second chance. Tools from 3 different decades hung in perfect order on pegboards. Parts salvaged from forgotten equipment filled labeled bins. The scent of motor oil, metal shavings, and coffee created a perfume that Bobby found more comforting than any designer cologne. A black and white photograph hung slightly askew on the wall beside his workbench, Bobby in his NASA uniform, standing proudly beside the engineering team for the Apollo guidance systems. Beside it, another photo, Bobby in his Boeing office, surrounded by fellow engineers working on advanced avionics for the F-15 Eagle. The third photo was more personal, Bobby and his late wife, Catherine, dancing at their son's medical school graduation. James McAllister, M.D., now practiced in Seattle, a city Bobby had visited exactly twice in the 8 years since his son moved there. The radio crackled with Johnny Cash's gravelly voice singing about walking the line, the sound occasionally interrupted by static. Bobby had modified the old Zenith with additional vacuum tubes and a custom antenna that could pull in signals from 3 counties away. In Clearwater Springs, Oregon, such adaptations weren't luxuries, they were necessities. "Should have this ready by Thursday. Maggie," Bobby called out to Margaret Wilkins, who was examining a shelf of rebuilt carburetors with the scrutiny of someone who knew precisely what she was looking at. "No rush, Bobby," she replied, tucking a strand of silver-streaked auburn hair behind her ear. "The South field's too muddy to work anyway." At 58, Margaret Maggie Wilkins had been running her family farm alone since her husband's heart attack 3 years ago. The bank had nearly foreclosed last year, until Bobby helped restructure her loan payments and rebuilt her irrigation system at cost. "You going to the town meeting tonight?" she asked, leaning against a weathered wooden post. "They're talking about Ravencorp's offer to buy up the watershed land." Bobby's hand tightened involuntarily around his wrench. Ravencorp. The name alone sent a current of tension through his weathered frame. What business do they have in Clearwater Springs? Supposedly building some kind of rural technology center. Mayor's all excited about jobs, but Maggie's voice trailed off, her expression skeptical. "But it's Ravencorp," Bobby finished, setting down his wrench with deliberate care. 30 years had passed since the F-15 crash that killed 16 test pilots. 30 years since Bobby had identified the fatal flaw in the flight control system, only to have his findings buried by Ravencorp executives who couldn't afford another delay in their government contract. 30 years since they'd made him the scapegoat, destroying his reputation and ending his engineering career. Sometimes 30 years felt like yesterday. "I'll be there," Bobby said finally. "Someone needs to remind folks what happens when you dance with the devil." After Maggie left, Bobby finished the tractor repairs, the rhythmic clanking of tools against metal punctuating the afternoon quiet. As sunset painted the sky in shades of amber and crimson, he stepped outside to stretch his back, cursing the stiffness that never seemed to leave his joints these days. That's when he noticed it. The back gate to his cornfield was ajar, swinging slightly in the evening breeze. Bobby frowned. He always kept that gate latched, a habit from decades of methodical precision. A quick survey revealed fresh tire tracks in the soft soil, too narrow for a truck, possibly from a motorcycle or ATV. Someone had been on his property while he was working. Grabbing a flashlight and his old .38 revolver from the drawer beside his workbench, Bobby followed the tracks into the cornfield. The stalks rustled ominously as he moved between the rows, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the gathering darkness. The tracks led deeper into the field, stopping abruptly near a small clearing where the corn had been trampled down. In the center of the clearing lay a black backpack, modern and expensive looking, with a smear of what appeared to be blood on one of the straps. Bobby approached cautiously, scanning the surrounding area for any sign of movement. Finding none, he crouched beside the backpack, his knees protesting the motion. The zipper was partially open, as if someone had been in a hurry. With the barrel of his revolver, he nudged the bag fully open, shining his flashlight inside. The contents made his heart skip a beat. A high-end laptop, thinner than any Bobby had seen before. 3 external hard drives, carefully wrapped in protective cases. A satellite phone unlike any civilian model on the market. And a Ravencorp employee badge featuring the photograph of a woman with intelligent eyes and a determined expression. Dr. Eleanor Winters, senior data scientist? "What the hell?" Bobby muttered, picking up the badge. Beneath it lay a sealed envelope with handwritten text on the front, "For whoever finds this, urgent." With a growing sense of unease, Bobby broke the seal and removed a single sheet of paper covered in a neat, precise handwriting. "If you're reading this, I may not have made it. Inside these drives is evidence of Project Chimera, a weapons system that makes Orwell's worst nightmares look like children's stories. Ravencorp is selling it to the highest bidders, including groups and governments who will use it to eliminate all opposition. Don't trust the authorities. They're already compromised. Find Marcus Hayes in Seattle. He's the only one who can verify this data securely. And whatever you do, don't let Ravencorp find you with this information." Eleanor Winters. Bobby read the note twice, his mind racing. Project Chimera. Ravencorp. Seattle, where James lived. The coincidence felt too precise to ignore. He gathered the backpack and its contents, making his way back to the workshop as quickly as his aging knees would allow. Once inside, he locked the doors and pulled the blinds, an old instinct from his security clearance days kicking in. Setting the backpack on his workbench, he stared at it as if it might detonate. "Should just call Dan," he muttered, referring to Sheriff Dan Holden, his fishing buddy and one of the few people in town he genuinely trusted. But the warning in Eleanor's note gave him pause. Don't trust the authorities. They're already compromised. Curiosity, or perhaps a dormant sense of justice, won out. Bobby fired up the laptop, surprised when it powered on without requiring a password. A sticky note attached to the keyboard explained why. "Facial recognition enabled will only unlock for me or for the finder. Emergency protocol." The screen displayed a simple directory containing dozens of folders with cryptic names. Bobby clicked on one labeled Overview, revealing a video file. With a deep breath, he pressed play. Dr. Eleanor Winters appeared on screen, her face drawn with exhaustion, but her eyes intense with purpose. "This is my official testimony regarding Project Chimera, a classified weapons system developed by Ravencorp under the guise of a civilian infrastructure security program." For the next 30 minutes, Bobby watched in growing horror as Eleanor methodically outlined the capabilities of Project Chimera, an AI-powered surveillance and targeting system that could identify, track, and neutralize individuals anywhere in the world through network devices, automated vehicles, and even medical implants. The system was originally designed for counterterrorism, Eleanor explained on screen, but Ravencorp has expanded its parameters to include potential social disruptors and economic adversaries terms so broadly defined they could include journalists, activists, or anyone who challenges corporate interests. Bobby felt a chill that had nothing to do with the automayor. He navigated to another folder labeled Targets and found a massive database of individuals categorized by threat levels and regions. What caught his eye was a smaller subfolder, Legacy Witnesses. His breath caught when he opened it. There, among hundreds of other names, was his own McAllister, Robert J., NASA Boeing, threat level dormant, status monitor for activation of Project Chimera, then neutralize. Son of a bitch, he whispered. Memories flooding back the F-15 crash investigation, the evidence he'd gathered, the executives who'd shut him down, the confidentiality agreement they'd forced him to sign before dismissing him. He'd always suspected there was more to the story than a simple design flaw. But this, the sound of tires on gravel snapped him from his thoughts. Bobby quickly shut the laptop and moved to the window, carefully peering through the blinds. A black SUV with tinted windows had pulled up outside, its headlights extinguished. Bobby's heart hammered as he grabbed his revolver. This was no coincidence. Either someone had tracked the backpack or they'd been monitoring him all along. He doused the lights and moved to his back office, watching through a small window as two men in tactical gear emerged from the SUV, their movements precise and coordinated. 30 years of peaceful existence in Clearwater Springs hadn't dulled Bobby's instincts from his military and aerospace days. He recognized professionals when he saw them. These weren't local law enforcement or common thieves. He had seconds to decide: confront them, hide, or run. The decision was made for him when a soft knock came at his back door, the one that led directly to his living quarters behind the workshop. Bobby raised his revolver, approaching silently on decades-old floorboards he knew wouldn't creak. "Mr. McAllister," a woman's voice called softly. "Please, I need help. It's about the backpack." Bobby's grip tightened on his weapon. "Who are you?" "Eleanor Winters. And those men out front are here to kill me, and now, probably you too." Bobby hesitated, then carefully unlocked the door, keeping his revolver raised. The woman who stumbled in matched the photo on the Ravencorp badge. Her right shoulder was soaked with blood, her face pale with pain and exhaustion. "Inside," Bobby whispered, helping her through before relocking the door. "Those men! Tactical team!" Eleanor gasped, leaning heavily against the wall. "Ravencorp's private security. There'll be more coming." Bobby guided her to a chair, his mind racing. "You're shot. Grazed," she corrected, wincing as she removed her jacket to reveal a nasty wound across her upper arm. "I've had worse." Before Bobby could respond, the sound of breaking glass came from the front of the workshop. Eleanor's eyes widened. "They're coming in." Bobby acted on instinct, grabbing the backpack in Eleanor's good arm. "This way," he whispered, leading her toward what appeared to be a storage closet. Inside, he pushed aside several boxes, revealing a trap door in the floor. "Storm cellar," he explained, pulling it open. "Built it during the Cold War. Old habits." They descended into darkness as the sounds of the intruders searching his workshop grew louder overhead. Bobby pulled a chain, illuminating the small space with a single bulb. The cellar was surprisingly well-equipped shelves of canned food, water jugs, a ham radio, and a narrow cot. "You're prepared," Eleanor observed, grimacing as she sat on the cot. "NASA taught me redundancy," Bobby replied, retrieving a first aid kit from a shelf. "Now, let's look at that arm while you explain why you've dragged me back into Ravencorp's mess after 30 years. As Bobby cleaned and bandaged her wound, Eleanor explained that she'd been working on Project Chimera for 3 years before discovering its true purpose. When she raised ethical concerns, she was quietly removed from key meetings. Then she found evidence that the project had already been deployed against test subjects, whistleblowers and journalists who had died in suspicious accidents. I couldn't be part of it, she said, flinching as Bobby applied antiseptic. So I gathered what evidence I could and ran. They've been chasing me for a week. And you came here because… Eleanor met his gaze directly. Because you're the only Ravencorp whistleblower who's still alive, Mr. McAllister. And because Project Chimera uses core algorithms derived from your work on automated guidance systems. Bobby froze. My work? From before the F-15 crash, she clarified. The neural network you designed for real-time flight adjustments, Ravencorp repurposed it as the foundation for Chimera's targeting system. The realization hit Bobby like a physical blow. His innovations designed to save lives had been weaponized. That's why I'm on their legacy witnesses list. Eleanor nodded solemnly. You know too much about the underlying technology, even if you don't realize it yet. Above them, the sounds of searching grew more aggressive. Furniture crashed, glass shattered. They're looking for the backpack, Eleanor whispered. And you, Bobby added grimly. What's your plan? I assume you had one beyond dropping evidence in a stranger's cornfield. I was headed to Seattle to find Marcus Hayes. He's an ex-NSA cryptographer who can authenticate the data and help release it securely. But they caught up with me faster than I expected. She gestured to her wounded arm. I had to ditch my vehicle and the backpack when I realized I was being followed. Bobby rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Seattle. My son lives there. Your son, James McAllister, doctor at Northwest Memorial. Eleanor's expression changed subtly, something Bobby couldn't quite read flashing across her features. Before he could question it, heavy footsteps crossed directly overhead, followed by a voice. Clear in the main workshop. No sign of the target or the package. Another voice replied, too muffled to make out clearly. Bobby and Eleanor remained perfectly still, barely breathing, until the footsteps receded. They'll be back, Eleanor said quietly. With more men and better equipment. Bobby nodded, a plan already forming in his mind. We need to move tonight. I know these hills better than any Ravencorp commando. But first, I'm going to need some things from the workshop, assuming they haven't destroyed everything. It's dangerous to go up there, Eleanor warned. Staying here is more dangerous, Bobby countered. Give me 15 minutes. If I'm not back, there's a tunnel that leads to the equipment shed about 50 yards east. Emergency exit. Before Eleanor could protest further, Bobby ascended the ladder, carefully pushing open the trap door. The workshop was in disarray, tools scattered, drawers emptied, his precious organized system reduced to chaos. But the intruders appeared to have moved on, likely expanding their search to the surrounding property. Working quickly, Bobby gathered essential items: ammunition for his revolver, a hunting knife, a flashlight with extra batteries, and a small toolkit. He also grabbed his old leather jacket, a canteen, and a topographical map of the region. From a hidden compartment beneath his workbench, he retrieved a small metal box containing emergency cash and a passport, a contingency he'd maintained since the Ravencorp incident decades ago. As he worked, Bobby's mind processed the situation with the same methodical precision he applied to mechanical problems. Ravencorp had found them, which meant they couldn't stay in Clearwater Springs. But they couldn't simply run either, not with Eleanor injured and Ravencorp's resources likely monitoring roads and communications. They needed allies. Bobby reached for the modified ham radio on his shelf, adjusting it to a frequency few would think to monitor in the digital age. He tapped out a message in Morse code, a skill he'd maintained through the local radio club that met monthly at Hank Peterson's shop. Need help. Shop compromised. Raven's here. Meet at the old fishing spot. Midnight. Apollo. The nickname would be recognizable to only two people in Clearwater Springs, Hank Peterson and Sheriff Dan Holden, both fellow radio enthusiasts who had served during the same era. It was a risk trusting them, given Eleanor's warning, but Bobby had known both men for decades. He was about to return to the cellar when headlights swept across the workshop windows. The SUV was returning. Bobby ducked behind his workbench just as the vehicle pulled up outside. Through a gap in the blinds, Bobby watched as a tall man in his early 60s emerged from the passenger side. Unlike the tactical team from earlier, this man wore a tailored suit beneath an open overcoat. His silver hair was military short, his posture ramrod straight. Something about him struck Bobby as familiar. The man surveyed the workshop exterior, then spoke to someone inside the vehicle. Even through the closed windows, Bobby could make out his voice commanding, with the unmistakable cadence of someone accustomed to giving orders. Expand the search perimeter to 3 miles. She's injured, so she can't have gone far. And if McAllister's helping her, he'll stick to areas he knows. The man turned slightly, his face now visible in the security light outside the workshop. Bobby felt his blood run cold as recognition dawned. Sebastian Reeves, former Delta Force commander, now Raven Corp's director of security. But Bobby knew him by another title, the man who had personally delivered the confidentiality agreement 30 years ago, who had made it clear that Bobby's silence was non-negotiable if he wanted to avoid complications. What Reeves said next made Bobby's heart nearly stop. And make sure the team in Seattle maintains eyes on Dr. James McAllister. If we can't find his father or Winters, the son becomes our leverage point. James. They were watching James. Bobby's paternal instincts surged with a ferocity that surprised him after years of emotional distance from his son. He had to warn James somehow, had to protect him from being dragged into this nightmare. But first, he needed to get Eleanor and the evidence to safety. Bobby returned to the cellar, finding Eleanor examining the ham radio equipment with professional interest. "We've got a problem," he said without preamble. "Raven Corp's security director is here personally, and they're watching my son in Seattle." Eleanor's face paled further. "Sebastian Reeves is here. That's unexpected. He doesn't usually handle field operations anymore." "You know him. By reputation," she said carefully. "He's been with Raven Corp longer than anyone, except maybe the CEO. If he's here personally, they're taking this very seriously." Bobby nodded grimly. "Which means we need to move now." They're expanding their search, and this will be the first place they check thoroughly once they regroup. He quickly outlined his plan. They would use the tunnel to reach the equipment shed, then take his restored 1965 International Harvester pickup, a vehicle whose absence might not be immediately noticed since he often worked on it in various locations around his property. "Can you walk?" he asked, eyeing her wounded arm. Eleanor stood, unsteady but determined. "I'll manage. What about the backpack? We take only the essentials, the drives, and the satellite phone. The laptop's too risky. They might be able to track it." She nodded in agreement, carefully transferring the hard drives and phone to a canvas tool bag Bobby provided. "One more thing," Bobby said, hesitating. "I sent a message to 2 old friends in town. If they respond, we'll meet them at midnight." Eleanor frowned. "You're trusting locals after what I told you about authorities being compromised." "These aren't just any locals," Bobby replied. "Hank Peterson served in Army intelligence during Vietnam. He can spot surveillance a mile away. And Sheriff Dan Holden was Navy before he took the badge. I'd trust either with my life." Eleanor still looked uncertain, but nodded. "Your territory, your call, but Raven Corp has resources to turn even old friends." Bobby led her to the tunnel entrance, a narrow passage reinforced with timber supports that sloped gently upward toward the equipment shed. As they moved through the darkness, guided only by Bobby's flashlight, he couldn't help reflecting on the irony of the situation. For 30 years, he'd lived quietly, trying to forget Raven Corp and the career they'd destroyed. Now, in the twilight of his life, he was on the run, protecting evidence of corporate malfeasance far worse than what he'd uncovered decades ago. The tunnel opened into a trap door beneath his equipment shed, a larger structure where Bobby stored his personal vehicles and larger restoration projects. The International Harvester sat in the corner, its red paint gleaming even in the dim light. "That's our ride," Eleanor asked skeptically. "Don't let the vintage fool you," Bobby said, patting the truck's fender affectionately. "I've rebuilt her engine with modern components. She'll outrun anything on these back roads, especially with someone who knows every turn. They loaded their meager supplies into the truck. Bobby disconnected the shed's automatic door opener, opting to manually raise the door to avoid any electronic signature. Before leaving, he retrieved a shotgun from a locked cabinet, loading it and placing it behind the seat. "Haven't fired this in years," he admitted. "But like riding a bicycle, I suppose." Eleanor eyed him with newfound respect. "You're handling this surprisingly well for someone who's spent decades as a mechanic." Bobby offered a grim smile as he climbed into the driver's seat. "I was NASA and military aerospace before I was a mechanic. Dr. Winters, we were trained to function under pressure." As the truck's engine rumbled to life, Bobby took one last look at the workshop that had been his sanctuary for the past 30 years. Whether he'd ever see it again was now an open question. "Where exactly are we going?" Eleanor asked as they pulled away, headlights off, navigating by moonlight. "The old Sullivan mining road," Bobby replied. "It's barely on any maps these days. Leads up into the hills, connects to fire access roads that can get us to the next county without touching a major highway." They drove in silence for several minutes, Bobby taking a circuitous route through his property before connecting with a nearly invisible dirt track that wound up into the heavily wooded hills. The truck handled the rough terrain admirably, its reinforced suspension absorbing the impact of roots and rocks. "They'll figure out we're gone soon," Eleanor said, breaking the silence. "And they'll have aerial surveillance." "That's why we're staying under the tree canopy," Bobby replied. "These old logging roads are practically tunnels through the forest this time of year. Thermal imaging won't penetrate the cover easily." The road narrowed as they climbed higher, the forest pressing in on both sides. Bobby navigated the switchbacks with the confidence of someone who had driven them countless times. Occasionally, he would slow to point out nearly invisible turnoffs or landmarks. "Old mine entrance there connects to a whole network underground if we need it. Emergency cache of supplies in that hunter's blind. Creek crossing ahead that doesn't appear on modern maps." Eleanor studied him with growing curiosity. "You've really prepared for something like this, haven't you?" Bobby's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Not specifically this. No. But after what Ravencorp did to me, let's just say I developed a healthy paranoia. These hills became my insurance policy." They reached a small plateau where the trees thinned slightly, providing a view of Clearwater Springs below. Bobby pulled over, cutting the engine. "We should be able to see if they've expanded their search," he explained, retrieving a pair of binoculars from the glove compartment. Sure enough, multiple black SUVs now prowled the main roads of Clearwater Springs, their distinctive profiles unmistakable even at a distance. Lights had been activated at the sheriff's office, suggesting law enforcement had been alerted, though, to what exactly? Bobby couldn't be sure. "They're establishing a perimeter," Eleanor observed. "Standard containment protocol." To her, Bobby handed her the binoculars, pointing to a cluster of buildings on the town's eastern edge. "That's Hank Peterson's radio shop. No activity there yet. And the sheriff's house is that one with the blue roof lights are on, but no vehicles in the driveway." He checked his watch. 4 hours until the midnight rendezvous. They couldn't simply wait here, exposed, but continuing further up the mountain would make it difficult to double back in time. "There's an old fire lookout tower about 2 miles ahead," Bobby decided. "Abandoned in the 90s when they switched to satellite monitoring. We can wait there, keep watch on the town, and still make the meeting point by midnight." They continued up the mountain, the road growing increasingly rough. Eleanor braced herself against the dashboard as the truck bounced over exposed roots and rocks. Despite her stoic demeanor, Bobby could see pain etching lines around her eyes each time the vehicle jolted her injured arm. "Almost there," he assured her, slowing as they approached a small clearing. The fire lookout tower rose above the surrounding pines, a skeletal silhouette against the night sky. Bobby parked the truck beneath a dense stand of trees, concealing it from aerial observation. The tower itself was a simple structure, a cabin perched atop a framework of wooden supports, accessible by a steep staircase that zigzagged up the side. Can you make that climb? Bobby asked, eyeing Eleanor's injury. She nodded, jaw set with determination. Wouldn't be the first time I've pushed through pain. They ascended slowly, Bobby leading the way with his flashlight, testing each step before committing his weight. The tower creaked and swayed slightly in the mountain breeze, but the structure remained sound. The cabin at the top was dusty but intact, a single room with windows on all sides, offering a 360-degree view of the surrounding wilderness. A simple desk, chair, and cot remained, along with a wood stove and some abandoned equipment. Home sweet home, Bobby muttered, setting down their supplies. At least for the next few hours. Eleanor sank onto the cot, exhaustion finally overtaking her. Bobby busied himself checking sightlines through the windows, confirming they could observe both the town below and the road they traveled. You should rest, he told her, setting up his binoculars on the desk. I'll keep watch. Not yet, Eleanor said, sitting up straighter despite her obvious fatigue. You deserve answers, Mr. McAllister. Real ones. Bobby turned to face her, sensing a shift in her demeanor. I'm listening. Eleanor withdrew one of the hard drives from the canvas bag. This contains the complete history of Project Chimera, including its origins in the F-15 neural guidance system you designed. But there's something I didn't tell you earlier. She met his gaze directly. The F-15 crash that ended your career, it wasn't a design flaw in the traditional sense. Ravencorp was already experimenting with remote override capabilities, a prototype for what would eventually become Chimera. The crash occurred during an unauthorized test of the system. Bobby felt as if the floor had dropped away beneath him. They were testing on active duty pilots without authorization. Eleanor nodded grimly. The project was compartmentalized. Most engineers working on it had no idea what they were building. When you identified anomalies in the system behavior, you became a threat to the entire Black program. 16 men died, Bobby said, his voice hollow. And they blamed me. You were the perfect scapegoat, Eleanor confirmed. A brilliant engineer whose concerns could be dismissed as paranoia or professional jealousy. By the time anyone might have reconsidered, your reputation was already destroyed. Bobby turned away, moving to the window to stare out at the distant lights of Clearwater Springs. 30 years of believing he'd missed something, that perhaps he'd been wrong after all. 30 years of second-guessing himself, of nightmares featuring falling aircraft and dying pilots. All because Ravencorp had been testing unauthorized technology. And now they're doing it again, he said finally, but on a global scale. Worse, Eleanor replied. They're selling it to anyone who can pay. Authoritarian governments, private military contractors, even terrorist organizations through shell companies. The ability to make any death look like an accident, to eliminate opposition without a trace. Bobby's mind flashed to James, his son, unknowingly under surveillance in Seattle. Was he a target too, simply for being Bobby's son? We need to get this evidence to Seattle, he said, resolution hardening his voice. But first, we need local allies. People Ravencorp won't be watching as closely. As if on cue, Bobby's modified handheld radio crackled to life, a series of beeps breaking the silence. Morse code. Apollo. Gemini here. Rendezvous confirmed. Midnight. Come armed. Ravens everywhere. Hank Peterson's call sign. He'd received the message. A second series of beeps followed Apollo. This is Eagle. Sheriff's office compromised. Unknown feds. Meet at alternate site. Midnight. Sheriff Dan Holden. Warning that his office had been infiltrated. Bobby translated the messages for Eleanor, who looked increasingly concerned. If they've already compromised local law enforcement, they're pulling out all stops, she said. This isn't standard corporate security anymore. This is a black operation with government-level resources. All the more reason to move quickly, Bobby replied, checking his watch. We have 3 hours until the meeting. I'm going to scout our route down. There's a back way to the meeting point that only locals would know. As Bobby moved toward the stairs, Eleanor called after him. Mr. McAllister, why are you helping me? You could have turned me in. Saved yourself the trouble. Bobby paused, considering the question. 30 years ago, I tried to do the right thing and lost everything. Maybe this is my second chance. He offered a grim smile. Besides, I've never been fond of bullies, corporate or otherwise. With that, he descended into the darkness, leaving Eleanor to rest in the tower. The night air carried the scent of pine and approaching rain, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled a lonely sound that seemed to perfectly capture Bobby's state of mind. The truth about the F-15 crash had reopened old wounds, but it had also ignited something he'd thought long extinguished, a determination to see justice done, no matter the cost. As midnight approached, Bobby guided the International Harvester down a nearly invisible firebreak that served as an emergency evacuation route for the Eastern Valley. Eleanor sat beside him, looking marginally better after a few hours of rest, her injured arm rebandaged with supplies from Bobby's first aid kit. The meeting point's an old fishing cabin on Sullivan Creek, Bobby explained as they navigated the steep descent. Used to be the local sheriff's private retreat back in the 70s. Not on any modern maps. How can you be sure it's not compromised? Eleanor asked, scanning the darkness outside. Can't be, Bobby admitted. But Hank and Dan know the risks as well as I do. If they detected anything suspicious, they wouldn't have confirmed the meeting. The truck's headlights remained off, Bobby driving by moonlight in memory through the dense forest. Each curve and dip in the primitive road seemed imprinted in his muscle memory, his hands automatically adjusting the wheel before obstacles became visible. They emerged from the tree line near a shallow crossing of Sullivan Creek. Bobby eased the truck through the knee-deep water, the reinforced undercarriage handling the rocky stream bed without difficulty. On the opposite bank, barely visible in the moonlight, stood a small log cabin nestled against a rocky outcropping. No lights were visible, but Bobby recognized Hank Peterson's ancient Dodge Power Wagon, parked in the shadows beside the structure. Sheriff Holden's personal vehicle, a mud-splattered Jeep Wrangler, was hidden beneath a camouflage tarp nearby. They're here, Bobby said, cutting the engine and letting the truck coast to a stop beside the power wagon. Stay alert. Even friends might not be what they seem tonight. They approached the cabin cautiously, Bobby leading with his revolver held low but ready. He knocked on the weathered door with a distinctive pattern, 3 quick taps. Pause, 2 more. The door opened a crack, revealing a sliver of Hank Peterson's weathered face, illuminated by the faint glow of a kerosene lantern inside. Apollo, Hank acknowledged, using Bobby's old radio club call sign. Password Tranquility Base, Bobby replied, referencing the first Apollo lunar landing site, a passcode they'd established years ago for their radio communications. Hank opened the door wider, ushering them inside. At 72, Hank Peterson was a tall, gaunt figure with a shock of white hair and hands gnarled from decades of detailed electronics work. Despite his age, he moved with the deliberate precision of someone who never wasted motion. Sheriff Dan Holden stood by the cabin's single window, peering out through a gap in the curtains. At 66, Dan retained the broad-shouldered physique of his Navy days, though his once dark hair had silvered completely. His sheriff's uniform had been replaced by civilian hunting attire, but the badge still hung from a chain around his neck. You've stirred up one hell of a hornet's nest. Bobby, Dan said by way of greeting. Half my deputies got sent home when some federal types showed up with paperwork I've never seen before. Not federal, Bobby replied, introducing Eleanor. Corporate security posing as federal agents. Ravencorp. Dan's expression darkened. Those bastards again after 30 years. Different issue, same playbook, Bobby confirmed. Dr. Winters here has evidence they're developing and selling unauthorized weapons technology. They're hunting her and now me to prevent that evidence from going public. Hank snorted, tapping his hearing aid. Figured it was something like that when they started jamming specific radio frequencies, military-grade equipment, way beyond what any legitimate operation would use in civilian territory. Bobby raised an eyebrow. They're jamming communications. Started about 3 hours ago. Hank confirmed. Cell networks are still up, but anything using specific emergency bands or military frequencies is getting static. Selective jamming, very sophisticated. Eleanor exchanged a significant look with Bobby. They're preparing for something bigger. This level of electronic warfare isn't standard procedure, even for Ravencorp security. Dan moved away from the window, his expression grave. Towns crawling with them, black SUVs at every intersection, men in tactical gear questioning anyone out after dark. They've set up checkpoints on all major roads leading out of the county. Which means we're trapped, Eleanor said softly. Not necessarily, Hank interjected, spreading a topographical map across the cabin's small table. Bobby's not the only one who knows these mountains. There's an old logging railroad that was converted to a maintenance road. Connects to the interstate through national forest land. No checkpoints because officially, it doesn't exist anymore. Bobby studied the route, nodding slowly. Might work, but it's rough terrain, lots of washouts this time of year. That old International of yours can handle it, Hank said confidently. I've seen what you've done to that suspension system. There's another problem, Bobby said, hesitating before continuing. They're watching my son in Seattle, using him as leverage if they can't find us. Dan's expression hardened. James, he's a civilian doctor. That's crossing a line, even for corporate thugs. Ravencorp doesn't recognize lines anymore, Eleanor said grimly. Not when Project Chimera represents billions in potential contracts. She proceeded to brief them on Project Chimera's capabilities, the evidence she'd gathered, and the broader implications of such technology being sold to the highest bidders. Both men listened in stunned silence, their expressions growing increasingly troubled. So they can make it look like an accident, Dan said finally. Heart attack, car crash, equipment failure, all remotely triggered. Eleanor nodded. And virtually untraceable unless you know exactly what to look for. Hank rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Explains a lot of convenient deaths over the years. Whistleblowers, journalists, activists, all those unfortunate accidents. The question is how to get this evidence to Seattle, Bobby said, bringing them back to the immediate problem. We need to find Marcus Hayes and get these drives authenticated before Ravencorp can intercept us. Or before they use your son as bait, Dan added grimly. A heavy silence fell over the cabin. The situation seemed impossible. Ravencorp had the resources, the manpower, and the technological advantage. They had compromised local law enforcement and established a perimeter that would be difficult to breach even for someone with Bobby's knowledge of the terrain. The silence was broken by the crackle of Dan's police radio, one of the few channels still functioning through the jamming. All units, be advised roadblocks are now in effect on state highways, 1244 and 157 per federal authorization. Stop and detain anyone matching the description of Robert McAllister or Eleanor Winters. Consider subjects armed and dangerous. Dan switched off the radio, his expression grim. They're not even pretending anymore. That federal authorization is bogus. I'd know if a legitimate operation was running in my jurisdiction. How much time do you think we have before they locate this cabin? Eleanor asked. Hank moved to the window, scanning the darkness outside. Hard to say. They're being methodical, searching grid by grid, but they don't have enough manpower to cover every square inch of wilderness. My guess is they're focusing on roads and known structures first. Bobby studied the map again, tracing potential routes with his finger. If we take the old logging railroad, we could reach Interstate 84 by dawn. From there, it's a straight shot to Seattle. Too obvious, Dan countered. They'll have every major highway monitored. You'd be better off taking secondary roads, even if it means a longer journey. What about air travel? Eleanor suggested. Small airfields might not be as heavily monitored. Hank nodded slowly. Peterson's crop dusting maintains a private airstrip about 30 miles north. My nephew runs it now. He might be willing to fly you as far as Portland. At least. That could work, Bobby agreed, already calculating fuel requirements and timing. If we leave now, We could reach the airstrip before dawn, be in Portland by breakfast, and continue to Seattle by alternative means. Eleanor looked skeptical. Raven Corp has surveillance capabilities beyond what you're imagining. Satellite tracking, drone networks, facial recognition through traffic cameras. Then we give them something else to track, Dan said suddenly, an idea forming. A decoy, something heading in the opposite direction that looks like you're making a run for it. My old Chevy, Bobby suggested. It's distinctive. Anyone in town would recognize it as mine. If someone drove it south while we head north, Dan nodded. I could do it. Take some back roads. Make it look like you're heading for California. They'll split their resources at minimum. Too dangerous, Bobby objected. They've labeled us armed and dangerous. If they catch you, I'm still the sheriff, Dan said firmly. Badge carries weight, even with corporate thugs. And I know how to disappear if things get too hot. While they debated the plan, Hank had moved to an old ham radio set up in the corner of the cabin. He adjusted frequencies, listening intently through a headset. Got something, he announced suddenly. They're using old military frequencies for coordination. Probably figured no civilians would be monitoring those bands anymore. They gathered around as Hank increased the volume, allowing a scratchy voice to fill the cabin. Team 2 in position at the McAllister property. No sign of targets. Team 3 reports negative contact along Highway 12. Surveillance drone has detected heat signatures at the Peterson Electronics store. Moving to investigate. All teams be advised Director Reeves wants the targets alive if possible. But the package is priority 1. Authorization for maximum force approved. Eleanor paled. Maximum force, they're not even pretending to follow legal protocols anymore. They're going after Hank's store, Bobby realized. Probably figured we'd go there for equipment or help. Hank's expression hardened. My daughter-in-law works the night shift there. She has nothing to do with this. We need to warn her, Dan said, reaching for his phone. No. Eleanor intercepted his hand. Cell communications aren't secure. They'll be monitoring all calls, especially from recognized numbers like yours. Then we need to move now, Bobby decided. Dan, take my Chevy and head south. Make it obvious. Let them spot you. Hank, can you create some kind of electronic distraction? Something to disrupt their communications temporarily. Hank's eyes gleamed with the enthusiasm of an old Signal Corps operator given a mission. Son, I've been waiting 30 years to put my jamming skills to good use again. Give me 20 minutes with the equipment in my truck. What about us? Eleanor asked, looking to Bobby. We take the International and head for the airstrip, using the old logging railroad as our access road. If Dan's decoy works and Hank can disrupt their communications, we might just have a fighting chance. They moved with renewed purpose, gathering supplies and finalizing details. Bobby provided Dan with keys to his Chevy, which was stored in a secondary location not far from the fishing cabin. There's a loaded shotgun under the seat, Bobby told him. Don't hesitate to use it if they try to run you off the road. Dan nodded solemnly. Just get to Seattle and protect your boy. And make sure these Raven Corp bastards pay for what they've done 30 years ago and now. While Hank worked on modifying radio equipment from his truck, Bobby and Eleanor loaded the International Harvester with additional supplies from the cabin's emergency stores. Dan prepared to leave, planning a route that would take him south through back roads where he could be spotted by Raven Corp surveillance without being immediately intercepted. One last thing, Bobby said, pulling Dan aside. If something happens to me, find James. Tell him I'm sorry for the distance these past years and that I was always proud of him. Dan clasped Bobby's shoulder firmly. Tell him yourself when this is over, but I promise if it comes to that. As midnight gave way to the early hours of the morning, the small group stood outside the cabin for a final council. The plan was set. Dan would create the southern decoy. Hank would trigger electronic disruption from a strategic location with good elevation, and Bobby and Eleanor would make their run for the airstrip using the abandoned logging railroad. Synchronize watches, Hank said, a phrase that felt like a relic from their younger days. Dan moves out at 1:100 electronic disruption. At 1:150s, Bobby and Dr. Winters depart at 1:120. They nodded in agreement, the gravity of the situation reflected in each face. Good luck, Dan said simply. Godspeed, Hank added. With that, they dispersed to their respective vehicles, each carrying a piece of the plan that would either secure their escape or lead to their capture. As Bobby started the International's engine, he glanced at Eleanor in the passenger seat, her face illuminated by the dashboard lights. Second thoughts, he asked quietly. She shook her head, determination evident in every line of her face. Not about exposing Project Chimera, but I am sorry for dragging you into this after you'd found some peace. Bobby's gaze drifted to the photograph of James he kept clipped to his sun visor, his son in graduation robes, smiling proudly with his medical degree. Peace is overrated when it's built on buried truths. Besides, they involve my son. That makes it personal. As they waited for their designated departure time, Bobby found himself reflecting on the strange turns life could take. For 30 years, he'd avoided confrontation, settled for a quiet existence far from the corporate and government powers that had destroyed his aerospace career. Now, in what should have been his twilight years, he was thrust back into a world of espionage, corporate corruption, and high-stakes pursuit. The irony wasn't lost on him. The backpack Eleanor had dropped in his field hadn't just contained evidence of corporate malfeasance, it had carried the catalyst for his own long-delayed reckoning with the past. At precisely Aero 120, Bobby put the truck in gear and began navigating toward the overgrown access point to the old logging railroad. Their journey to Seattle and to whatever awaited them there had begun in earnest. But as they passed beneath the shadow of the mountain, neither Bobby nor Eleanor noticed the small blinking device attached to the International's undercarriage, a tracking beacon placed there not by Ravencorp operatives, but by someone much closer to their inner circle. The betrayal had already been set in motion, though its architect remained hidden in the shadows. And in Seattle, Dr. James McAllister was about to receive a visitor who would reveal just how deeply his father's past was intertwined with Project Chimera and with his own carefully constructed life. The game was far larger and far deadlier than any of them had imagined. The abandoned logging railroad hadn't seen maintenance in decades, yet it remained the most viable escape route from Clearwater Springs. Bobby navigated the International Harvester with practiced precision, its reinforced suspension absorbing the punishment of ruts and washouts. The pre-dawn darkness wrapped around them like a protective cloak, broken only by the truck's headlights cutting through stands of towering Douglas firs. How much farther to the airstrip? Eleanor asked, bracing herself as they bounced over a particularly rough section. About 15 miles, Bobby replied, downshifting to tackle a steep incline. Assuming Hank's electronic disruption worked, we should reach it before Ravencorp reestablishes their communications network. Eleanor checked the satellite phone, its screen casting an eerie blue glow across her face. Still no signal. That's good, means Hank's jamming is effective. The truck crested the hill, revealing a spectacular view of mountain ranges stretching to the horizon, their peaks silhouetted against the first hint of dawn. Under different circumstances, Bobby might have paused to appreciate the vista. Instead, he focused on the winding path ahead, knowing that each minute brought them closer to either escape or capture. You never finished telling me about the connection between Project Chimera and my work, Bobby said, breaking the silence. How did Ravencorp weaponize a flight guidance system? Eleanor shifted in her seat, wincing as the movement aggravated her wounded arm. Your neural network was revolutionary. It could predict and adjust for atmospheric conditions faster than any human pilot. Ravencorp didn't just adopt it, they inverted it. Meaning, instead of helping aircraft avoid problems, they reprogrammed it to create them. The system that once compensated for unexpected turbulence could now generate fatal flight patterns that would appear as natural mechanical failures or pilot error. Bobby's hands tightened on the steering wheel. The F-15 crash. They were testing this inverted system. Yes, Eleanor confirmed, but that was just the beginning. Over the decades, they expanded the concept beyond aircraft, modern vehicles, medical devices, infrastructure systems. Anything with computer controls became a potential weapon. And now they're selling this capability to anyone with deep enough pockets. Bobby concluded grimly. Exactly. Imagine a world where any death can be engineered to look natural or accidental, where dissidents, journalists, or political opponents simply have convenient heart attacks or car crashes. No assassins, no evidence, no accountability. The implications were staggering. Bobby had spent his career designing systems to make transportation safer, more reliable. The perversion of that work into a global assassination network represented everything he had fought against. We need to make a slight detour, Bobby said suddenly, turning onto an even narrower trail that branched from the main logging road. Why I thought time was critical. It is, but something's been bothering me since we left the cabin. Bobby glanced in the rearview mirror, scanning the darkness behind them. Ravencorp's resources are too extensive for the kind of escape we're attempting. They should have found us by now. Eleanor's expression tightened. You think we're being tracked? It's what I would do if I were them. The question is how. Bobby steered the truck into a small clearing and cut the engine. We need to check the vehicle. Thoroughly. They exited into the crisp mountain air, the silence profound after the truck's constant rumble. Bobby retrieved a flashlight from behind the seat and began a methodical inspection of the International's exterior. Check your clothing and belongings too, he instructed. Any electronic devices apart from the satellite phone and hard drives could be compromised. Eleanor complied, emptying her pockets and examining each item. Bobby continued his inspection of the truck, moving from the engine compartment to the undercarriage. It was there, nestled against the frame rail, that he found a small black device with a blinking red LED. Got something? He called, carefully detaching the magnetic tracker. It was military-grade, compact and weather-sealed, not the kind of equipment available to civilian security forces. Eleanor examined it, her expression darkening. This isn't standard Ravencorp issue. This is advanced NSA or Pentagon level. Could they have that kind of access? Ravencorp has government contracts across multiple agencies. But this, she turned the device over in her hands. This feels different, more precise. Bobby's mind raced, calculating possibilities. The question is, when was it planted at the cabin earlier? Does it matter they know where we are? It matters because it tells us who we can trust. Bobby took the tracker, examining it closely. This is high-end, but it's not new technology. Hank would recognize it immediately. He worked with similar systems in Vietnam. Understanding dawned in Eleanor's eyes. You think Hank or Sheriff Holden? I don't want to believe it, Bobby admitted. But we need to consider all possibilities. The decision came quickly. They would leave the tracker attached to a passing logging truck headed in the opposite direction, creating a false trail while they continued to the airstrip. Bobby flagged down a pre-dawn lumber transport, offering the surprised driver $100 to carry a scientific wildlife monitoring device for a few miles. Back on the road, with the tracker moving steadily away from them, Bobby felt marginally safer, but the discovery had planted seeds of doubt that couldn't be easily dismissed. If someone close to him had betrayed their location, who could they truly trust? The sky lightened to a pale gray as they approached Peterson's crop dusting service. The private airstrip was little more than a cleared stretch of land with a single hangar and a modest control shed. A weather-beaten windsock fluttered in the morning breeze. Bobby parked behind the hangar, out of sight from the main access road. Wait here, he instructed Eleanor. Let me make sure Hank's nephew's actually willing to help us. The hangar door was unlocked, its interior dimly lit by overhead fluorescence that flickered erratically. A yellow crop duster, a restored Piper PA-25 Pawnee, dominated the space. Its engine compartment open for maintenance. Hello, Bobby called out. Mike, it's Bobby McAllister. Movement from beneath the aircraft preceded the appearance of a man in his 40s, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. Mike Peterson had his uncle's lanky build, but none of his reserved demeanor. "Bobby, what the hell are you doing here at this hour?" Mike asked, surprise evident in his voice. "Need a favor?" "Mike, a big one." Bobby quickly explained the situation, omitting the details about Project Chimera, but emphasizing the danger. "Your Uncle Hank said you might be willing to fly us to Portland." Mike's expression shifted from confusion to concern. "Corporate security? Must be serious if they've got you on the run." He hesitated, glancing at the Piper. "She's not exactly set up for passengers, but I could make it work." "When do you need to leave?" "Now, before Raven Corp figures out we've slipped their net." Mike nodded, tossing the rag aside. "Give me 15 minutes to finish these ignition adjustments and file a basic flight plan. Can't take off without one or we'll have the Air Force on our tail." While Mike prepared the aircraft, Bobby returned to the truck to retrieve Eleanor. Her face was drawn with fatigue, the wound on her arm clearly causing significant discomfort despite her stoic demeanor. "You need medical attention," Bobby observed as he helped her toward the hangar. "Later," she dismissed. "Once we're airborne." Mike greeted them at the hangar door, his eyes widening slightly at Eleanor's condition. "Ma'am, are you sure you're okay to fly? This isn't exactly a pressurized cabin, and it might get bumpy." "I've endured worse," Eleanor assured him, straightening her posture through sheer willpower. "If you say so," Mike ushered them inside, pointing to the Piper. "I've reconfigured the chemical tank area into makeshift seating. It's not comfortable, but it'll get you to Portland Regional Airport in about 2 hours." Bobby inspected the arrangement basic canvas seating installed where agricultural chemicals would normally be stored. The Piper was designed as a single-pilot aircraft, but the modification would allow for 2 passengers in cramped conditions. "It'll do," Bobby decided. "Thank you. Mike, this means a lot." Mike shrugged, but his expression remained troubled. "Uncle Hank's done right by me my whole life. If he says you need help, that's good enough for me." He paused. "But Bobby, you should know there was a call about an hour ago, asking if I'd seen any unusual activity at the airstrip." Bobby tensed. "Raven Corp didn't say, but they knew my name, knew I operated this airstrip, seemed to know a lot about me. Actually," Eleanor and Bobby exchanged concerned glances. "What did you tell them?" Eleanor asked. "Nothing. Said I was just getting to work and hadn't seen anyone." Mike checked his watch. "But they might send someone to verify. We should move quickly." They loaded their minimal belongings into the aircraft, securing the hard drives in a waterproof case that Mike provided. As the hangar doors rolled open, revealing a sky now streaked with orange and pink, Bobby felt a moment of trepidation. He hadn't flown in years, and never in an agricultural aircraft configured for crop dusting. Mike conducted final pre-flight checks with efficient precision, then gestured for them to board. "It's going to be loud, cold, and not particularly comfortable," he warned. "But she's reliable. Got me through some nasty weather over the years." Bobby helped Eleanor into the makeshift passenger compartment, then climbed in beside her. The space was indeed cramped, their shoulders pressed together, knees drawn up to accommodate the limited legroom. Mike handed them aviation headsets. "These will help with communication and noise." As the Piper's engine roared to life, vibrating through the airframe, Bobby found himself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought him here. 3 days ago, he'd been a simple mechanic with a quiet life. Now he was a fugitive, fleeing with classified corporate data, about to fly to Seattle to confront both his estranged son and the corporation that had destroyed his aerospace career. The aircraft taxied to the end of the grass runway, its movement jolting and uneven on the rough surface. Through the small window, Bobby could see the mountains silhouetted against the rising sun, a view both magnificent and foreboding. "Clearwater Springs traffic, Piper 259er 7 Bravo, departing runway 27 westbound," Mike announced over the radio, following proper protocol despite the private nature of the airstrip. The engine's pitch increased as Mike advanced the throttle, the Piper accelerating down the runway with surprising speed. The agricultural aircraft was designed for power rather than comfort, its single engine straining to lift them into the morning sky. As they became airborne, banking gently to establish their westward heading, Bobby glimpsed movement on the access road leading to the airstrip, the unmistakable profile of black SUVs approaching at high speed. "Mike!" Bobby said urgently into the headset microphone. "We've got company." Mike glanced back, spotting the vehicles. "Hang on," he replied, pushing the control yoke forward to remain low over the trees. "Let's see if we can disappear before they get a visual." The Piper skimmed the treetops, following the contours of the landscape rather than climbing to a conventional cruising altitude. It was a risky maneuver, one that would confound radar tracking, but required exceptional piloting skills. "Your uncle mentioned you flew in the Air Force," Bobby recalled, watching Mike's confident handling of the aircraft. "3 tours," Mike confirmed, navigating around a ridge with precise control. "Search and rescue, primarily, taught me how to fly low and fast in places most pilots wouldn't dare." Those skills proved invaluable as they evaded the approaching Ravencorp security team. Mike kept the Piper below radar coverage, following river valleys and mountain passes rather than conventional flight paths. The journey was turbulent, the aircraft buffeted by wind currents and thermal pockets, but they remained undetected. An hour into the flight, with Portland still distant on the horizon, Eleanor broke her contemplative silence. "Mr. McAllister," she began, her voice barely audible over the engine noise despite the headsets. "There's something else you should know about your son." Bobby turned to her, tension gathering in his chest. "What about James?" Eleanor hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Dr. James McAllister isn't just a regular physician at Northwest Memorial. He's part of a specialized research division, one that receives significant funding from Ravencorp." The revelation hit Bobby like a physical blow. "What are you saying, that my son is involved with Project Chimera?" "Not directly, no. But his work on neural interfaces for medical applications has been incorporated into Chimera's infrastructure without his knowledge." Eleanor met his gaze directly. "Ravencorp has a pattern of compartmentalizing research, ensuring no single scientist sees the complete picture. Your son developed technology to help paralyzed patients regain motor function. Ravencorp repurposed it to create undetectable methods of eliminating targets through their own medical devices." Bobby stared out the window, processing this disturbing connection. James, like him, had been unwittingly drawn into Ravencorp's web of weaponized technology. "Does he know about any of this?" "I don't believe so. His research papers suggest he's genuinely committed to therapeutic applications, but his access to Northwest Memorial systems would be valuable to anyone seeking to authenticate the Chimera data." The implication was clear. James wasn't just potential leverage against Bobby, he was a necessary ally in exposing Project Chimera. But bringing him into this dangerous situation went against every paternal instinct Bobby possessed. "How do you know so much about my son's work?" Bobby asked suddenly, a new suspicion forming. Eleanor's expression revealed nothing. "Project Chimera required me to analyze all potential vulnerabilities, including researchers whose work was incorporated without their knowledge. Your son's name appeared in those assessments." Before Bobby could press further, Mike's voice crackled through the headsets. "We've got a problem. Portland Approach Control is directing us to an auxiliary runway for special security processing." "Ravencorp," Eleanor confirmed grimly. "They've alerted air traffic control." "Options?" Bobby asked. Mike studied the navigation instruments, calculating alternatives. "We can divert to a smaller airfield, but they'll track the deviation immediately. Or," he hesitated. "Or what?" Bobby prompted. "Or we make an unscheduled landing. I know a private ranch about 20 miles northeast of Portland. Owner's an old Air Force buddy who asks 0 questions, has a decent strip for his own Cessna." It was a significant deviation from their plan to reach Seattle directly, but the risk of landing at Portland under security scrutiny was too great. "Do it," Bobby decided. Mike banked the Piper, adjusting their course toward the northeast. The change would be obvious to air traffic control, likely triggering alerts throughout the system. Their window of opportunity was closing rapidly. The ranch appeared below them 10 minutes later, a sprawling property nestled against the Columbia River, with a visible grass airstrip cutting through pasture land. Mike circled once to check wind direction and potential obstacles, then lined up for landing. No radio contact, he explained. Don't want to broadcast our location more than necessary. The landing was rough but controlled, the Piper bouncing slightly on the uneven surface before settling into a smooth roll. Mike taxied toward a small hangar at the far end of the strip, cutting the engine as they approached. "Welcome to Riverside Ranch," he announced, removing his headset. "Home of retired Colonel Jack Wilson, who happens to owe me about a dozen favors." As if on cue, a weathered pickup truck approached from the main house, dust billowing behind it. The driver, a barrel-chested man in his 60s with a military-precise crew cut, regarded the crop duster with hands planted on his hips. "Michael Peterson," he called out as Mike descended from the cockpit. "When you radioed about an emergency landing, I wasn't expecting a goddamn aerial invasion." Mike grinned, shaking the older man's hand. "Sorry for the dramatic entrance. Colonel, we're in a bit of a situation." Bobby helped Eleanor from the aircraft. Noting how she concealed her pain behind a facade of professional composure, the colonel's eyebrows rose slightly at their disheveled appearance. "What kind of situation requires a crop duster to go AWOL from its flight plan?" he asked, though his tone suggested he'd encountered similar circumstances before. "The kind where corporate security teams are masquerading as federal agents," Bobby replied bluntly. "Raven Corp." The name triggered immediate recognition in Colonel Wilson's eyes. "Defense contractor. Worked with them on some classified projects back in the day." He studied Bobby more carefully. "You have the look of someone who's been there too. Boeing and NASA, before Raven Corp destroyed my career 30 years ago," Bobby confirmed. "Now they're after us because we have evidence of their latest illegal operation?" The colonel considered this for a moment, then nodded decisively. "Well, you picked the right emergency landing spot. My property doesn't officially exist on most government registries' perks of 30 years in military intelligence." He gestured toward the house, a sprawling ranch-style structure, partially hidden by mature oak trees. "Let's get you inside before any curious satellites pass overhead. And your friend looks like she could use medical attention." Eleanor started to protest, but the colonel raised a hand. "Ma'am, I was a field surgeon before I became a pilot. I know a gunshot wound when I see one, even poorly concealed." The interior of the ranch house reflected its owner's military background: practical furnishings, strategic positioning of windows and doors, and subtle security features that Bobby's trained eye immediately noticed. A ham radio setup occupied one corner of the living room, alongside modern communications equipment that seemed excessive for a rural property. "Still keeping your ear to the ground," Colonel Bobby observed, gesturing to the sophisticated array. Colonel Wilson smiled thinly. "Old habits. Been monitoring some interesting chatter this morning, a lot of encrypted traffic on frequencies that shouldn't be active in civilian airspace." While the colonel attended to Eleanor's wound in a well-equipped home medical station, Mike pulled Bobby aside. "I need to get back," he said quietly. "If I'm missing too long with the Piper, they'll expand their search parameters." Bobby nodded in understanding. "You've risked enough already. Go back. Maintain your normal routine. If anyone asks, you forced me at gunpoint," Mike finished with a wry smile. "That's what Uncle Hank suggested as your cover story. Makes you sound more desperate, less like someone with a plan." After Mike departed in the Piper, Colonel Wilson joined Bobby at the kitchen table, setting down a pot of coffee and 2 mugs with military precision. "Your friend will be fine," he reported. "Clean wound. No infection yet. I've given her antibiotics and proper dressing. She's resting now." He poured the coffee, regarding Bobby with shrewd assessment. "So, Robert McAllister. I remember that name from the F-15 incident." Bobby tensed. "You know about that? I flew F-15s. Son, every pilot knew about the crash that killed 16 of our best." Official story never sat right with many of us. The colonel sipped his coffee. Some of us suspected there was more to it than a design flaw or pilot error. There was, Bobby confirmed, feeling a weight lift at speaking this truth aloud to someone who understood its significance. Ravencorp was testing unauthorized remote override capabilities. When I discovered anomalies in the system behavior, they made me the scapegoat. Colonel Wilson nodded, unsurprised. And now they're expanding that technology into something called Project Chimera, a global assassination system that can make any death look accidental. Eleanor has the evidence, but we need to get it authenticated by a specialist in Seattle. And Ravencorp is throwing everything they have at stopping you. The colonel drummed his fingers on the table thoughtfully. Including compromising civilian law enforcement and air traffic control. That's an extraordinary reach for a private corporation. They have connections throughout the government, military, and intelligence communities, Bobby explained. Decades of classified contracts have built them a network of influence that transcends normal corporate limitations. And you're planning to expose all this? The colonel raised an eyebrow. Bold move for a retired mechanic. I've been running from what happened for 30 years, Bobby replied, steel entering his voice. I'm done running, but I need to reach Seattle and my son before Ravencorp does. Colonel Wilson leaned back, considering. Portland's compromised. SeaTac will be worse, but there are alternatives. He rose, moving to a cabinet from which he retrieved a detailed map of the Pacific Northwest. I maintain certain, unofficial transportation networks, remnants from my active duty days that still prove useful occasionally. He spread the map across the table, pointing to a location along the Columbia River. There's a private marina here. Friend of mine runs charters that don't always appear in official logs. He could get you to Astoria by water. From there, you can take the coastal route to Seattle, less monitored than the interstate. It wasn't ideal, water travel would be slower than flying, but it offered a path forward that might evade Ravencorp's surveillance net. Bobby studied the route, calculating time and risk factors. How soon can we leave? I'll make a call, the colonel replied. But first, there's something you should consider. His expression grew more serious. Ravencorp wouldn't commit resources on this scale unless they were truly desperate. Have you considered what that means? Bobby had, in fact, been puzzling over this very question. It means Project Chimera represents something beyond normal corporate interests, something they believe is worth destroying lives to protect. Exactly. And in my experience, that level of desperation usually indicates one of two things: imminent exposure of criminal activity or imminent deployment of a classified asset. The colonel's gaze was penetrating. Which do you think we're dealing with here? The question hung in the air, its implications chilling. If Project Chimera was already being deployed, they weren't just racing to expose a potential threat, they were trying to stop an active weapons system that could be targeting victims at that very moment. Both, Bobby concluded grimly. They've already sold early versions to certain clients, based on Eleanor's evidence, but the full system is about to go live, which would make exposure catastrophic for them. Colonel Wilson nodded, the confirmation of his suspicions evident in his expression. Then your journey to Seattle isn't just about clearing your name or exposing corporate malfeasance. It's about preventing what could become the most invisible mass assassination program in history. The weight of this responsibility settled on Bobby's shoulders, making his personal vendetta against Ravencorp seem almost trivial by comparison. This was no longer about vindication for a 30-year-old injustice. It was about preventing countless future injustices. I need to speak with Eleanor, Bobby said, rising from the table. We need to verify exactly what stage Chimera has reached and who might already have access. Colonel Wilson directed him to a guest bedroom where Eleanor rested, her injured arm properly bandaged and supported in a sling. She looked marginally better. Some color returned to her face, though exhaustion still marked her features. Colonel Wilson is arranging boat transportation to Astoria, Bobby informed her, taking a seat beside the bed. But we need to discuss Project Chimera's current status. Is it already operational? Eleanor shifted to a sitting position, grimacing slightly at the movement. Partially. 3 clients have early deployment versions: a Middle Eastern intelligence agency, a Eastern European security service, and a private military contractor based in Africa. But these are limited systems, restricted to specific geographic regions. And the full version, scheduled for deployment within 72 hours, that's why I ran when I did. It was the last possible moment to prevent global activation. Bobby calculated mentally. So we have less than 2 days remaining? Yes. Once fully deployed, Chimera becomes substantially harder to disable. It's designed with distributed architecture, no single point of failure. The stakes were even higher than Bobby had realized. And my son Yu said his work was incorporated without his knowledge. How central is it to Chimera's functioning? Eleanor hesitated, something unreadable flickering in her eyes. His neural interface work provides a critical component for the medical intervention module, the part that can trigger cardiac events or neurological failures that appear natural. So he could help disable it? Potentially, yes. But involving him means putting him directly in Ravencorp's crosshairs. Her expression softened slightly. I understand your reluctance. Mr. McAllister, I've put you in an impossible position, having to choose between protecting your son and preventing a global catastrophe. Bobby stood, moving to the window to stare out at the Columbia River flowing peacefully in the distance. The irony wasn't lost on him, how his life had come full circle. From designing systems meant to save lives to now racing against time to prevent his innovations from being used to end them. James and I haven't been close these past years, he admitted quietly. After his mother died, something broke between us. Different priorities, different worlds. He turned back to Eleanor. But I know my son. If he understood what his work was being used for, he'd want to help stop it regardless of the personal risk. Eleanor nodded, respect evident in her gaze. Then our path is clear. We get to Seattle, find Marcus Hayes to authenticate the data, and contact your son to help disable Chimera's medical module. A knock at the door preceded Colonel Wilson's entrance. Transport arranged, he announced. Boat leaves from Hammond Marina at 1800 hours. I'll drive you there myself. Thank you, Colonel, Bobby said sincerely. We won't forget this. Don't thank me yet, Wilson cautioned. Getting you to the marina undetected won't be simple. Ravencorp has established vehicle checkpoints on most major roads leading west, and I've picked up increased chatter suggesting they've narrowed their search parameters to this general region. How? Eleanor asked, alarmed. The tracking device was removed. Could be satellite surveillance, facial recognition through traffic cameras, or communications monitoring, Wilson suggested. Or someone in your trust circle is feeding them information. The possibility of betrayal had lingered in Bobby's mind since discovering the tracking device. Hank and Sheriff Holden are the only ones who knew our full plan, and Mike Peterson, to a lesser extent. Don't discount broader surveillance, the colonel warned. Ravencorp has contracts with multiple intelligence agencies. They could have access to resources beyond normal corporate reach. This sobering reminder of their adversaries' capabilities prompted a revision to their plan. Rather than traveling directly to the marina, they would take a circuitous route, using Colonel Wilson's knowledge of back roads and surveillance blind spots. Additionally, they would adopt basic disguises, nothing elaborate, but sufficient to defeat automated facial recognition systems. As evening approached, they prepared for departure. Colonel Wilson provided them with clean clothing, basic supplies, and a secure satellite phone programmed with encrypted communication protocols. Military grade, he explained, handing the device to Bobby. Cycles through frequency bands that civilian scanners can't track. Use it only in genuine emergencies. Each transmission increases your digital signature. He also supplied Eleanor with proper medical supplies for her wound and a sidearm for Bobby, a Beretta M9, the standard issue he had carried during his military service. Been a while since I fired one of these, Bobby commented, checking the weapon with muscle memory that had survived decades of disuse. Like riding a bicycle, the colonel assured him, though I hope you won't need it. As they loaded into the colonel's nondescript pickup truck, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. Bobby found himself studying Eleanor as she carefully settled into the back seat, her movements deliberate to avoid aggravating her injury. Despite their time together, she remained enigmatic in many ways. Her knowledge of Project Chimera was comprehensive, her determination to expose it unquestionable. Yet there were moments when Bobby sensed she was withholding something, particularly regarding his son's involvement. "We should reach the marina in about 2 hours," Colonel Wilson announced, pulling onto a dirt road that would eventually connect with less-traveled county routes. "Assuming we don't encounter any unexpected roadblocks." The journey proceeded in tense silence, each of them scanning the surroundings for signs of pursuit or surveillance. Wilson navigated with the confidence of someone intimately familiar with the terrain, occasionally deviating from their route to avoid areas he deemed potentially monitored. As darkness fell, they approached the outskirts of Hammond, a small fishing community where the Columbia River met the Pacific Ocean. The marina came into view, a collection of weathered docks extending into the dark water, illuminated by scattered security lights. Colonel Wilson parked in a shadowed area behind a storage building, cutting the engine. "Your contact is Davis Mercer," he informed them. "Slip 14, 40-foot cabin cruiser called Second Chance." "Fitting, don't you think?" Bobby nodded, appreciating the coincidence. "How do we recognize him? Former Navy SEAL, missing left ear, not the friendly type, but reliable once he gives his word." Wilson handed Bobby an envelope. "Payment's already arranged, but he'll expect this passcode. Memorize it, then destroy the paper." Bobby studied the alphanumeric sequence, committing it to memory before burning the paper with Wilson's offered lighter. The code would authenticate them to Mercer without revealing their identities to potential eavesdroppers. "This is where we part ways," Wilson said, extending his hand to Bobby. "Good luck, McAllister. If you succeed in exposing Project Chimera, you'll have done this country a greater service than most who wear the uniform." "Thank you, Colonel, for everything." Eleanor echoed the sentiment, her expression solemn. "Your assistance won't be forgotten when this becomes public." Wilson's smile was grim. "Better if it is forgotten. Dr. Winters. Men like me prefer to remain in the shadows." He nodded toward the marina. "Now go. Mercer doesn't like to be kept waiting." They exited the vehicle, making their way cautiously toward the docks. The marina was relatively quiet at this hour, with only a few figures visible on distant boats. The salt-laden air carried the sense of fish, diesel, and weathered wood, familiar elements of coastal life that seemed surreally normal given their circumstances. Slip 14 housed a well-maintained cabin cruiser, its white hull gleaming softly in the security lights. The name Second Chance was painted on the stern in elegant blue script. A solitary figure stood on the aft deck, his posture conveying military alertness despite the casual setting. Bobby approached the gangway, Eleanor a step behind him. "Evening," he called softly. "I'm looking for Davis Mercer." The man turned, revealing a weathered face with the distinctive absence of a left ear, the result of some long-ago combat injury. "Depends who's asking," he replied, voice gravelly from years of shouted commands and whispered operations. Bobby recited the passcode, watching as Mercer's expression shifted from suspicion to businesslike acceptance. "Wilson said there'd be two of you," Mercer observed, stepping aside to allow them aboard. "Didn't mention one would be injured." "Will that be a problem?" Eleanor asked directly. Mercer shrugged. "Not unless you get seasick. Then it's your problem, not mine." He gestured toward the cabin. "Stow your gear below. We leave in 10 minutes. The cabin was surprisingly comfortable, with efficient use of limited space, a small galley, navigation station, and sleeping quarters for 4. Bobby secured their belongings while Eleanor examined the nautical charts spread across a table. "Astoria's a 5-hour journey in good conditions," she noted. "Longer if the weather turns." "Wilson mentioned you have contacts in Seattle," Bobby said, joining her at the charts. "Someone who can authenticate the Chimera data?" "Marcus Hayes," Eleanor confirmed. "Former NSA cryptographer who specialized in verification of classified intelligence." One of the few people with both the technical skills and the security clearance to prove the Chimera evidence is authentic, and you trust him as much as I trust anyone in this situation. Her expression turned grave, which is to say, cautiously. Hayes has his own reasons for opposing Ravencorp, but he's not without his own agenda. Before Bobby could press for details, the engine rumbled to life beneath them. Mercer appeared at the cabin doorway. "We're moving out. Stay below until we clear the harbor. Less chance of being spotted that way." As the boat glided away from the dock, Bobby felt a momentary surge of hope. Each mile of river between them and Clearwater Springs represented distance from Ravencorp's most concentrated search efforts. By dawn, they would reach Astoria, and from there, Seattle was just a few hours' drive along the coast. The plan was taking shape, the pieces aligning. Yet as Bobby watched Eleanor checking the security of the hard drives containing the Chimera evidence, a persistent question nagged at him. What was she still not telling him about James? The answer would come sooner than he expected, and it would change everything he thought he knew about his son, Eleanor Winters, and Project Chimera itself. As the Second Chance navigated the dark waters of the Columbia, cutting through the night toward Astoria, neither Bobby nor Eleanor noticed the sleek drone maintaining position high above them, its thermal imaging capturing their every movement. And in Seattle, Dr. James McAllister received an encrypted message on his private terminal, a message bearing the Project Chimera insignia, and a simple directive: prepare for Phase 3 activation. Hannah, the true scope of the conspiracy was about to reveal itself, and Bobby McAllister would soon discover that finding a backpack in his field was merely the first step in a journey that would test not only his courage, but his most fundamental beliefs about family, loyalty, and redemption. As dawn breaks over the Seattle skyline, the scattered remnants of Project Chimera lie exposed to the world, digital ghosts haunting the servers of agencies that once denied their existence. Sometimes victory doesn't feel like you imagined, not with bandaged wounds still aching and the faces of those who didn't make it still fresh in your mind. Bobby McAllister stands at his son's side, their shadows finally aligned after decades apart, watching as reporters swarm the Ravencorp headquarters in the distance. The corporate giant has fallen, yet the old mechanic finds no joy in vengeance, only the quiet relief of a burden finally set down. For 30 years, he rebuilt engines while his own life remained in pieces. Now, ironically, it took running for his life to finally find his way home. The bullet-riddled International Harvester sits in James's driveway, a battle-scarred testament to second chances that arrive when we least expect them, and to the courage that hides in ordinary people pushed to extraordinary circumstances. They say the most valuable thing a father can leave his son isn't wealth or property, but a name worth bearing. As Bobby watches the morning light catch on the Justice Department badges moving through Ravencorp's lobby, he wonders what we're all capable of when the backpacks of fate suddenly appear in our own quiet fields, and whether we'll have the courage to open them when they do.